Thank you. So this talk on the day before we honor Martin Luther King Jr. is about the weight of history of our country, the United States, the weight of our growth, the weight of our wealth, the weight of our culture. And it's a weight borne to a large degree without consent and without adequate compensation by Africans brought against their will to this land. This talk is connected to a project that I began on January 1st, some of you know about, that I'm simply calling 400 Years. You can pick up information out there or from me afterwards about it. It's a modest project that grew out of my own desire to clarify my relation to the freedom struggle of slaves and the descendants of slaves. It's grown to be more about how we, particularly those of us who identify as white, should respond to this sad story that began when Africans were first brought here 400 years ago this year. It's a challenging talk. I apologize if it touches on trauma that may affect you, but I hope it's going to be useful to you wherever you are in your relationship to this history, whether you're getting over white fragility, as we talked about at the Friday meeting of the Anti-Racism Task Force, or if you're just unsure of how to approach it. The weight of history has been placed disproportionately on the shoulders of some people who were unjustly burdened with this lifelong struggle and toil for carrying this weight. Because they carry the weight, others, like most of us in this room, live relatively comfortable lives. And this weight was carried by heroes of the freedom struggle as well, like Martin Luther King Jr. himself, or Rosa Parks, or Harriet Tubman, or Octavio Cato, Davis Cato, or the desperate souls that were on the slave ship Amistad. And how those of us lucky enough to live comfortable lives, who want to lift a bit more of that weight, how we do that when we're too timid or unsure. How do we do it better? How does anybody lift any of the weight of that when you try to do it, it feels like it's going to crush you because it's so heavy? It's a question that grew in me over 25 years of teaching about our nation's ingenious system of race-based oppression, from indentured servitude through chattel slavery to sharecropping, Jim Crow, segregation, lynching, discrimination, and today our racially biased criminal justice system. It's a question that challenges me to help heal these devastating wounds, and it's a question that weighs on me. I don't want to give the impression, however, that this weight for me, is anywhere near as great as the weight carried by my friends and colleagues of color. The legacy of slavery falls on all people with dark skin, whether they're descendants of slaves or not, in ways that are infinitely heavier than how it weighs on me. And I thank the many people of color who, through books and through conversations, have given me the courage to try to carry a little bit more of this weight. This talk is not meant to be an analgesic or a quick fix for white guilt. That is our own work that we have to do more ourselves. And I'm also going to try to avoid the white savior complex, where my own need to be seen as doing good outweighs the very real needs of my fellow Black Americans. This work must be guided by Black Americans, but done by everyone. Work begins now in the present and continues on, perhaps forever in this country. But it is best if we do this work with the sort of optimism and strength of that song that we sang. It's best done with hope and joy, but without craving absolution or savoring pride. And finally, before I really begin, I can't speak today about the spectrum of bigotry that confronts people of all shades, of all colors. I don't have time. I can't adequately address the many other forms of oppression that come based on gender orientation, identity, socioeconomic status, religion, more. And I cannot even speak for other whites. I know that. So today I'm mainly speaking for myself, from my heart, with all the flaws that such an appeal can entail. So I hope you forgive for the search of shortcomings that are certainly in this work in progress. Get Out. One of the greatest films of recent years. Jordan Peele unveils what he calls the sunken place. For those of you who haven't seen Get Out, I apologize for a little bit of a spoiler. I'll try not to do too much. But if you haven't seen it already, then shame on you. The sunken place is where the character, Chris Washington, ends up when he's caught in a psycho-racist trap of his girlfriend's family. This young black photographer is paralyzed by a surreal white supremacy. He's brainwashed so that some whites can appropriate some soul and participate in blackness on their own sadistic terms. And a weight envelops around Chris, and he sinks down and down and down. I think that this film, which Peele both wrote and directed, is so powerful because it taps both a particular historical reality for African Americans in this country and a universal fear of being trapped under an omnipresent weight. Peele draws the viewers in only to reveal a haunting rendition of America's racial divide. Chris Washington experiences an ominous series of microaggressions that, highlighted by a very creepy musical score, tells the viewer of a horrible fate that is coming his way. Jordan Peele explains that the sunken place is something blacks understand because, quote, we're marginalized. No matter how hard we scream, the system silences us. But I think we can all imagine what it's like to be silenced and being crushed by the weight of history. Maybe that's what Peele meant when he tweeted out, quote, we're all in the sunken place. Dubian Ade, an activist, artist, and writer for the Atlanta Black Star, appreciated how all people who consider themselves part of the resistance right now can feel unified by Get Out. He wrote, quote, the sunken place has become an expression of frustration for people who feel more marginalized now than ever in the age of Trump. Now, I'd love to think that a 2-hour film could unify all the resistors right now under this shared repulsion of racism. But the specific experience of blacks is what drives the film for Jordan Peele. The fact that many blacks feel denied control of their own body. And it's complicated. Dubian Ade admits this. He says, for him, not only is his body at risk, but his future is at risk. He writes, the sunken place is real. I spent 12 years in the public education system in New York. I don't think it's any better in Philadelphia. Ade writes this. I've heard echoes of this in the city. He goes on to explain how underfunded schools and underpaid white teachers taught him to accept being in the sunken place. He writes, we were taught that we would not succeed or amount to anything. We were made to feel embarrassed by our inabilities. We were ashamed of our teachers' fear of us, and therefore ashamed of our blackness. So caught in the grips of this systemic racism, Ade experiences this sinking feeling that Chris Washington feels. Ade finishes saying, in our vulnerability, we submit to white supremacist power and sink through the floor into the sunken place. Again, if you haven't seen the movie, this may sound a bit cryptic, but when you're in the sunken place, you're no longer of this world. You've been denied your body, your relationships, even your name. Maybe that's why Peele echoed the fact that when Africans were brought to this land, they were taking their name away, they were given a first name. Often the second name was the name of their master or of a famous American. And I wonder whether Jordan Peele chose the name of his main character, Chris Washington, to be the name of the first president, the slaveholding father of our country. In Ebony magazine, the lead actor, Daniel Kaluuya, summed up some lessons that he drew out of Get Out. He says racism is just mainstream now, and racism has always been here, is here, so it's like with the guy in power, people are just honest about it. So it's exciting that this is probably the most racially visceral time for a long time that this film is coming out. And you know that pissed people off. I'm here, I'm ready, I'm not scared of anyone. Now personally, for me, this visceral experience is what connected both Get Out with various current aspects of racism. It stirred up in me an awareness of many blacks who were and still are trapped under this weight of white supremacy that runs through American history and culture. The movie made me think of the book Between the World and Me, and how the weight of history pressed down on its author, Ta-Nehisi Coates, and on his family as well. Coates warns his son, Samori, how habits and structures of unbounded bigotry made life fundamentally unfair, how danger stalks young black men like a nightmare or a horror film. Coates explains to Samori how police departments are, quote, endowed with the authority to destroy your body. He goes on to destroy the embodied nature of that threat. He writes, racism is a visceral experience. It dislodges your brain. It blocks your airways, rips muscles, extracts organs, cracks bones, breaks teeth. Now, I've heard many black parents who have to give similar talks to their children find that their love and their fear are so intertwined. It's why Coates explains black people love their children with a kind of obsession. You are all we have, and you come to us in danger. I think we would like to kill you ourselves before seeing you killed by the streets that America made. That is a philosophy of the disembodied. What a horrible thing to have to carry as a parent. Coates' language, though, I think gave many people the ability to talk about films like Get Out. One movie reviewer named Jacob Skubish said he was reminded how narratives like Coates' book or Peele's film taught him how white supremacy is not only upheld by a system of laws and institutions, but by a powerful story that we tell ourselves. Skubish points out how Chris Washington in the film finds himself in purgatory, quote, directly akin to Coates' rumination on the American black experience. We are invited to listen, but never to truly join the narrative, is what Coates said. Coates continues, white supremacy is a crime and a lie, but it's also a machine that generates meaning. And this meaning is very dark sometimes. Now, for many white progressives, including myself, we prefer a more comfortable narrative about liberal faith and progressive hope for a better future. Despite the crushing reality of 400 years of oppression, we like to believe that, as one of our most accessible heroes said, we like to believe that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. It gives us hope, but it's a hope that Coates and Peele says is so elusive for black Americans. For them, it's more of a myth. As a young history student, I embraced many comfortable myths. I believed that progress was inevitable. I believed that the North was destined to win the Civil War, that slaves would be free, that they'd be given the vote. I believed that that would happen, and it had to happen. And it was easy to believe that inside a bubble of privilege and comfort. But Coates urges us to discard this myth and embrace a more complicated and an uncomfortable past. He wrote, "You must struggle to truly remember this past in all its nuance, error, and humanity. You must resist the common urge towards the comforting narrative of divine law, toward fairy tales that imply some irrepressible justice. There is no irrepressible justice. There's only justice that we make." Now, Coates has no faith in the comforting narrative. The weight of history threatens him, threatens his son. And he explains to Samori A mountain is not a mountain if there is nothing below. You and I, my son, are that below. One black writer, David Wong-Wale, wrote about the damage done by this mountain, by the fate of being on the bottom. He describes how, by design, blacks were stripped of their name, their culture, their identity, and that now, quote, many of us still do not know who we truly are. Blacks have been thrown away, ignored, deeply traumatized, and this trauma led to self-loathing. According to Amawale, many of us have come to hate our blackness because trauma has made us associate our identities with the traumas that we have endured. Being African for us is painful, so we run away from it. So I think, how could a book or a movie like Get Out get me even close to understanding what it would be like to be in a black body in this country at this time? And maybe the closest I'm going to get to the sense of a visceral nature of weight borne by blacks is through narratives, through story, through books, through movies. I felt the visceral experience in Get Out. I felt it when I read Between the World and Me. And it's not about what's in our head. It's really what presses down on our heart. What makes it hard for us to breathe. I can't breathe. I feel this visceralness through study of history, which is why I was so impressed the first time I saw the Martin Luther King Memorial in Washington, D.C., that stands like a mountain in our nation's capital. Its design came from King's I Have a Dream speech, where he said, out of a mountain of despair, a stone of hope. So from this mountain emerged a 55-ton granite statue of King, arms folded, powerful, strong, looking across the tidal basin at the memorial of the slaveholder Thomas Jefferson. And at that moment when I saw it, I felt that King's weight in that statue was a match for the weight of history. For much of his life, King carried others, not just other blacks who looked towards him for leadership and courage, but he also carried a lot of whites who craved an end to racial hostility. He carried me when I was a kid. He was my hero. He offered hope until he was killed by an assassin's bullet on the balcony of the Lorraine Hotel in Memphis. He could carry that weight no more. And suddenly his weight had to be carried, his legacy into history and his body to the grave. And I feel that weight when I look up at that memorial statue. In a very different way, that weight is essential to another memorial that's actually in the birthplace of the Confederacy, Montgomery, Alabama. Brian Stevenson, who wrote the book Just Mercy and his Equal Justice Initiative, created the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in the Legacy Museum. Visitors speak of a visceral experience to Memorial Square. This is an outdoor plaza with 800 square steel columns that hang by chains like corpses. Each of the 800 columns represent one of the counties in the United States where racial lynching took place. The names of the victims are engraved on each. Most of the perpetrators were not held accountable. Each of these columns, suspended over the earth, remind me of a grisly irony that it was the weight of the bodies that left these people with snapped necks or suffocation as their fate. And the descriptions of public lynchings that are too sadistic and horrible to talk about today induce feelings of disgust and shame and inadequacy. But I remind myself that the weight of these feelings is greatest in those who embody these historical truths, my friends and colleagues of color. So why did it take until December of this last year for the Senate to pass a law making lynching a hate crime? What are the next steps? We could dwell on what was done to the bodies of those here brought from Africa, to the bodies of their children and their grandchildren and their great-great-grandchildren, but how often do we have to read about the chains and the branding and the torture and the mutilation and the separation from families? You know the basics. How much do we have to read about that when the pain sears so deeply into to so many people of dark skin. If you're white, it is relatively easy to escape. You don't have to come to talks like this. The weight of this history, but for many people of color, the weight continues to press on them regardless of where they are. Sometimes it's just a reminder in some sort of callous display of the news that you're reading about around the country. Whether this comes from a poorly thought out college prank or whether it's actually a warning of real violence to come, it touches on deep trauma. But back in 1935 at Howard University, students took that pain and turned it into a tool. Out in front of the Memorial Continental Hall of Howard University, black students stood with nooses around their neck to protest lynching that was still going on in this country. And just last year, Jerry Wilson, a graduate student of UNC Chapel Hill, protested Confederate monuments on their campus by doing the same, by putting a noose around his own neck. He was protesting, in this case, a monument nicknamed Silent Sam, which was erected 100 years ago with a speech globally referring to the horsewhipping of a black woman. One professor at UNC described Wilson's noose as protesting and disrupting the tradition of Confederate monuments that honor individuals who advocated and committed very real acts of violence against black people. Another student, Cortland Gillum, who protested with the noose, talked about the unfair distribution of the weight of history. He said, "There's a historic burden that as Americans we all share, but only some of us are forced to carry." The Equal Justice Initiative wants this weight to be more equally distributed. So next to all of the 800 columns, each one engraved with the names of victims of lynching, each one representing a county where the lynchings occurred, next to each of these columns is a duplicate column that Brian Stevenson hopes county officials from around the country will take back to their county to make monuments to the victims in their own counties where it occurred. I think it'll be a while before those 800 columns are taken, however, because those counties have monuments of Confederacy already standing in the way. The Southern Poverty Law Center estimates that there are 718 such monuments in this country, along with 100 high schools or colleges named for generals or other Confederate icons. Yes, it's all symbolic, but it touches trauma. These monuments are defended by people like you and me in many, many ways, but by people who have been unable to get rid of a myth. People don't let go of their heroes easily. They may argue that the monuments are simply about universal stoic virtues like liberty, loyalty, battlefield genius, courage under fire. They're just military monuments, so what's the problem? One decorated military veteran, General Stan McChrystal, came to see the problem. He wrote about growing up with a comfortable myth that obscured the reality of racism. From my earliest days, Robert E. Lee felt close at hand. I attended Washington Lee High School in Arlington, Virginia, and began my soldier's life at Lee's alma mater, the U.S. Military Academy. Today, if Lee still lived in my childhood home in Alexandria, Virginia, we would be neighbors, McChrystal writes. And that's why when he was a young cadet, he so admired the statue of Lee that was at West Point, nicknamed the Marble Man. He talks about how institutions evolve more slowly than people. McChrystal says that the military holds tenaciously onto its myths. But more recently, with white nationalism rising out of the 2016 election, McChrystal changed as a person. His admiration for Lee, who he said was my hero, brilliant, valiant, loyal, clashed with the angry, torch-bearing white supremacists that were marching through Charlottesville. Urged on by his wife, McChrystal threw a painting of Lee he had in his home into the trash. Choosing facts over fiction, McChrystal quotes President Kennedy, who said, "The great enemy of truth very often is not the lie, deliberate, contrived, and dishonest, but the myth, persistent, persuasive, and unrealistic. So I applaud McChrystal's throwing away of the painting of Lee and writing about it in national magazines, but I can't help thinking that he really unburdened himself by doing that, while others with darker skins still carried the weight. I also can't help and think about how, despite our differences, I'm a lot like McChrystal. He acknowledged that being in the military, tradition and pride kept him from thinking twice about army bases that were named after defenders of slavery, like Forts Bragg, Benning, Polk, Hood, Lee. Was it a similar weight of my Ivy League institution that kept me from noticing and challenging the name of one of the residential colleges at Yale, Calhoun, named for one of the most virulent and powerful races the South has ever produced, John C. Calhoun? Was it the weight of tradition at Georgetown University that kept officials there ignorant or uninterested about the sale of 272 human beings by Jesuit priests so that the school would solve its financial difficulties? Was it the weight of history that led Michael Eric Dyson, a black professor at Georgetown, to feel, quote, pride tempered by profound grief at the sight of Georgetown students demanding some form of reparation from their college? Our own University of Pennsylvania was complicit in racism, as most institutions that have lasted this long in this country are. And you'll hear about that next week when you come back from Kathy Brown and Van Jessica Gladney's explanation of that, right here. Now, in search of silver linings, I love stories of redemption about whites like McChrystal or institutions like Georgetown taking up anti-racism work. And that is wonderful. But I'm also aware that Ta-Nehisi Coates is right when he says that whites that are accused of racism are, quote, obsessed with the politics of exoneration. One of the greatest anti-slavery activists in this country, William Lloyd Garrison, was more concerned with not being associated with slavery than the actual fate of slaves. So I wonder whether the younger people in this country are going to do better, those who grew up with Black Lives Matter, who grew up with President Obama, whether their anti-racism work will be better, whether it will be more understanding of overlapping forms of oppression. Maybe a Williams College student named Nole Peraza will be more effective. She visited the Birmingham and the Lincoln Memorials, and she wrote an article entitled The Weight of Dr. Martin Luther King Day, Jr., and she stood where King gave his speech, but she also understood that many women in the civil rights movement didn't have their own memorial to them. They were banished to their own sunken place. And she urged us tomorrow to take a moment to think about people like King's wife and daughter, Coretta Scott King and Bernice King, who are really the architects of the King legacy. Peraza pointed out that overlooked women also have to carry, quote, an additional burden that eliminates their voices and thereby their contributions to society. And the Women's March that occurred yesterday, fracturing over these things, we all have to work on those. Maybe the weight of history would be more effectively carried out by a young Harvard student, Anastasia Sorochinsky. She wrote an article called Addressing the Weight of History. And she did a study of schools in the South, and she talked about the fact that the civil rights movement is covered in at least 9 of the 12 states that were in the Confederacy. But she did a study and she found out that 16 states have no instruction at all about the civil rights movement. Sorochinsky described visiting the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute with a friend who was not as educated about the civil rights movement as she was. And she said, my friend's reaction was one of overwhelming shock when he saw the harsh reality of the city's history and the way it affects the present. Sorochinsky concludes by saying, the challenge of ensuring history's weight is carried forth through lessons, both universal and distinctly local, is something that we have to take up. So these students offer me hope. Many seem to be willing to carry the weight of history despite their being so young. Sometimes I think that being older, I have been more steeped in certain myths, steeped in the white savior narrative or the liberal optimism that makes me think that we can just try a little harder and things will get better. But as a product of primarily a white privileged institution, I realize that we need more of a revolution. So this year, I'm marking the 400th year anniversary when the first people from Africa were brought against their will to North America with a little project that I'm simply entitling 400 Years. While continuing to work on issues like criminal justice reform and funding for schools and inner cities and jobs that pay a decent wage, I've made the following commitment this year, and that is that every week I'm going to write and distribute 400 words about the history and resistance to racism. I'll offer 400 lessons that I draw from these reflections. I'm going to create an annotated bibliography of 400 books and articles that I think are important to read. But most importantly, I'm going to seek out 400 commitments from 400 people who pledge to confront systemic racism more directly than they have through concrete action. So I'm not looking for 400 people who have been working on this to just say I'm going to work harder, keep working. I'm looking for 400 people that want to work harder but don't know how. So I invite you to join me to pick up some of this weight of history and regarding race, whether it's whites in particular who want to make a difference. It's not time to be shocked by movies like Get Out. It's time to get in, to get involved. For too long, our brothers and sisters of color have carried a disproportionate amount of that weight. In acknowledging that my project's only a tiny step in this unending anti-racist campaign, I invite you who want to do this more, to do it without pride, but with some joy and with some confidence. I think we can lift more of the weight of history. Thank you very much.